Hello and welcome to the final part of our four-part series looking at PhD and MPhil regulations, a guide for our supervisors. In today's final session we will be looking at examinations and appeals. Neil, would you like to start us off?
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Yes, in this presentation we're going to start off by considering how the thesis will be examined. Then I'll run through a couple of ways in which we might say things that will be going wrong, either in terms of the student being suspected of academic misconduct or the student being unhappy with the decisions we've made. And then Chris will indicate at the end how you can find out more. Okay, so in terms of examining the thesis, this slide explains the process for examination, and then we have a slide talking about the outcomes. So the first point in terms of the process is officially there's no writing up stage. I mean, clearly students will have to write up. What this is about is that there's no special stage called writing up in which students get a lower fee. The standard fees are charged right up to the point at which students submit their thesis. And the start of the examination procedure is when the student submits an intention to submit form, and that must be submitted at least 2 months before the expected submission date. And it is important to encourage your students to submit by that time scale, because it will take Chris quite a long time to get an examination arranged. And just giving you an example there, if we have a student who starts on the 1st of February 2015, this means, bearing in mind the timescales for completion of a PhD, that the intention to submit form would have to be submitted no later than the 30th of November 2018 full-time or the 30th of November 2020 part-time. So, in other words, as soon as the student starts, we know exactly when the intention to submit form must be completed. The examination itself is conducted by at least 2 examiners. One of them must be an external examiner, and there must normally be at least 1 internal examiner. And the internal examiner is not a member of the supervisory team. Although the supervisor is clearly supervising the student, is encouraging the student, guiding the student, and may well be present at a mock viva, the real examination is conducted entirely by people who are not members of the supervisory team. So the student is on their own defending their thesis. It does say normally at least 1 internal supervisor and at least 1 external examiner. The exception to that would be if the candidate was a member of staff at the university, in which case we might say 2 external examiners, not an internal examiner. As would be the case in other universities, the examiners are recommending an outcome based not only on the thesis itself, but also by their defence of the thesis at an oral examination. And it is, of course, impossible to indicate how long the oral examination is going to be. It could last an hour, it could last 2 hours, 3 hours, or longer. It will last as long as is needed in order for the examiners to arrive at an agreed recommendation. The penultimate point is very important, that the oral examination is chaired by an independent chair. Now, the independent chair is appointed by Liverpool Hope and will be a member of staff at Liverpool Hope. And the role of the independent chair is not to have read the thesis, not to examine the thesis, but to make sure that the examination is conducted according to due process. In one way, you could see the independent chair as being the registrar's representative at the examination. And they're there in order to make sure that the student gets a fair deal. Now, they are empowered to suggest that there's a break if the student appears to be tired. They're there to make sure that students are being given fair questions and are given a fair opportunity to respond to questions and so on. And the final point on this particular slide is that the examiners are only recommending an outcome. The outcome has to be approved by the Progression and Reward Board, which meets in March, May, July or September. And the decision is then formally published by Hope University by the Student Administration team. And this slide talks about the outcomes of the examination. And these are outcomes in terms of a PhD, and at the end I'll talk about outcomes for the award of an MPhil. So the outcomes for the examination for a PhD are as follows. Normally there will be one of the first four outcomes shown on the slide. First of all, the students may be awarded a PhD with no further work required. Now that is very rare. Secondly, much more common is the award of a PhD subject to minor amendments. And in this case, the examiners would have basically decided that this thesis is worth a PhD, but the student needs to do a small amount of further work, minor corrections and so on, and they will be given up to 3 months to resubmit. The third outcome is that the candidate will be given the award of a PhD subject to major amendments. So this is clearly a more substantial requirement. Students here would be given 1 year to resubmit, and it would be up to the examiners to determine whether or not a further examination was needed. But effectively, they've already made a decision that, subject to the major amendments being satisfactorily completed, that the degree of PhD would be recommended. The fourth outcome is re-examination required, and students will now have at least 2 years to resubmit. And there are two major differences, I suppose, between this and the previous recommendations. First is clearly the amount of work that needs to be done by the student is even more substantial, and so 2 years is required. But the other difference, which conceptually is a lot more important, is that the examiners have not yet decided whether the thesis is worthy of a PhD or not. So it's a further examination required for the award of a thesis, and there is no indication as to whether the outcome of that would or would not be that the award of a PhD would be recommended. So those are the normal outcomes. Exceptionally, the examiners could recommend more severe outcomes, those being either the award of an MPhil or the award of an MPhil subject to minor amendments, subject to the same timescales as above, or the award of an MPhil subject to major amendments, subject to the same timescales as above, or re-examination required for an MPhil. And again, the examiners have not yet decided whether in principle this thesis is worthy of an MPhil. And then finally we have a very exceptional outcome, which is fail, terminate studies and no award given. Now, clearly that would only happen under very exceptional circumstances, but one possible circumstance might be if during the examination process it was determined that the student had plagiarised the thesis. Now, I've indicated these are the outcomes for a PhD. If instead of being examined for a PhD, the student was being examined for an MPhil, then clearly the outcomes shown as exceptional outcomes for a PhD are in fact the normal outcomes for an MPhil. In these slides, we're moving on to look at issues of academic misconduct. And there's two slides. The first one talks about what counts as misconduct. And there's 5 possibilities. One is plagiarism. Secondly, collusion. Thirdly, fabrication of data. Fourthly, cheating in the oral examination or in the confirmation interview. This is probably quite difficult in the confirmation interview because the student will be known to the panel, but in the oral examination the supervisor's not there, so in principle it's possible that personation may take place. Or the 5th possibility for misconduct is if the student submitted without due acknowledgement work for which an award had already been granted. So for example, if the student had included in their PhD thesis work which they'd already submitted for an MSc dissertation. Now, if they had submitted work which came from the MSc dissertation and this was acknowledged as having come from their MSc dissertation, then that's fine. But what would not be fine would be if the student submitted work from their MSc dissertation giving the impression that this was in fact work which the student was now submitting for the PhD, and that will be treated as very serious misconduct. If you suspect the student having engaged in misconduct, it says here normal Hope University's procedures typically apply, and my advice is that if you suspect misconduct, then in the first instance, you may wish to contact me if you suspect misconduct has occurred. If you're based in one of our partner institutions, in the first instance, you may wish to contact the Hope moderator, who might then liaise with me. So, moving on, this slide considers the penalties available for misconduct, and you'll see that there are three aspects to this, and then there's a final comment at the bottom. And you'll see that the three different types of penalty depend upon where we find the misconduct. So first of all, if the misconduct occurs in work which has been submitted for the annual monitoring process, for the confirmation of registration process, or other events before the submission of the thesis, then the board basically has discretion. Either it can terminate studies, or it could categorise the student as not yet being satisfactory or in a further assessment required position, and in which case the board would allow one further attempt. And clearly the board would exercise its discretion bearing in mind the severity of the offence, but it's worth being clear that even for annual monitoring, termination of studies is a possibility open to the board. Secondly, if misconduct had occurred in the thesis, and the normal outcome there is termination of the student's studies. The third point is refers to a case in which misconduct had been found in the thesis after the degree had been conferred, and the normal outcome there would be that the degree would be rescinded. Now, finally, at the bottom, we've addressed the issue as to what happens if misconduct is suspected in a draft of the thesis. Now, clearly this is slightly different because the draft of the thesis has no official statement. It's not being submitted for assessment as such, so there can be no penalty. However, there is a requirement in the Code of Practice for the Director of Studies to draw the matter to the attention of the student and to inform the student of the penalty for misconduct in the thesis itself. In other words, the Director of Studies would point out that the student appeared to have engaged in misconduct in the draft and would explain that if the thesis also gave an indication of misconduct, then the student would expect to have their studies terminated. Now, clearly students would probably not like their studies terminated, may be inclined to appeal, which leads to the final substantive area of this presentation, which is about the appeals procedures. And again, there's a couple of slides. First of all, what is it that students can appeal against? And effectively, they can appeal against any decision approved by the Progression and Award Board. So it's only when the Progression and Award Board has made its decision that a student can appeal. What's in the remit of the Progression and Award Board? Well, it's all the points on the slides. So the annual monitoring outcome, confirmation of registration, examination of the thesis, or a penalty for an academic misconduct. So any of those could lead to an appeal once the decision has been published by the board. The procedures, again, the normal Hope University procedures would typically apply. And in the first instance, my advice is if a student is not happy with the published outcome, initially they should have an informal discussion with the Director of Studies to see if there's an informal way of resolving the matter. If not, in the first instance, they should email appeals@hope.ec.uk with an indication of that they wish to appeal. They will get a form and we will take it from there in terms of the normal process. And this final slide really talks about the possible grounds for an appeal. And I put at the top of the slide grounds which are potentially valid, and thirdly, grounds which are typically not valid. So the first ground is a material irregularity in relation to one of the three main forms of assessment, which is annual monitoring, confirmation of registration, and examination of the thesis. Material irregularity basically means that the university did not follow its procedures, and this would have been material to the outcome. The second type of ground is mitigating circumstances that the board was unable to divulge before the board meeting. Now, clearly, the university's normal fit-to-sit policy applies to postgraduate research students as well as anybody else. So we would not take an outcome that the student had to do major modifications and change that to minor modifications on the grounds of mitigating circumstances. What we might do on the grounds of mitigating circumstances is to declare an assessment null and void on the grounds that the student was not actually fit and had good reasons for not drawing that to our attention at the time. What grounds are typically not valid? There are three. One is challenging academic judgment. I've said that as opposed to a judgment made by academics. What this means is that if a student simply does not agree with the outcome, if, for example, they think that their thesis should have been awarded a PhD with only minor amendments, the fact that they disagree with the judgment that they should have major amendment is not a valid ground for appeal. Which doesn't mean that every judgment made by academics is immune from appeal, but the only judgments which could be appealed against are those where the academic is making a judgment outside their area of expertise. So if, for the sake of argument, a supervisor determined that a student should have attended the confirmation of registration interview despite the fact that a blizzard was blowing outside, it's a judgment made by the supervisor but not in their academic capacity, so that is potentially subject to appeal. A second ground which would not be valid would normally be a perceived problem in learning and teaching, for example, perceived problems with supervision. And the normal expectation is that if students have issues with how they're being supervised, they should have raised this at the time. And in order for an appeal and along those lines to be accepted, we would need to have a convincing explanation as to why the matter wasn't raised earlier. Now, clearly, one potential ground which could not be raised earlier would be if it only emerged as part during the examination that the supervisor had given inappropriate guidance. For example, a student was failed for following a particular type of methodology when the student can indicate that was precisely the methodology advised by their supervisor. The final grounds which would be invalid would be grounds which have already been considered by the board. So if the board had already been made aware that the student had a particular type of mitigating circumstances and that had been taken into account when deciding to uphold a recommendation of the examiners, then the student would not in fact be able to cite those mitigating circumstances as grounds for an appeal.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Neil. That was very helpful. If supervisors would like more information, it is available on our web pages, particularly our regulations and code of practice, along with a number of other things. For colleagues in the faculties here at Hope, you may want to contact your PGR coordinators or your faculty administrators, and the contact details are there, and we would encourage you to do so in the first instance. If you are based at one of our partner institutions at Newman, Maryvale or St Mary's, you may wish to contact the Hope moderator, or indeed you may wish to contact your colleagues at the university in the first instance. Thank you for listening to our 4-part presentation, and we hope that these sessions have proved useful. Thank you.